The year that I began teaching on the college level was also the first time that I had been in a situation where students were to evaluate their teachers. And to get this evaluation from my former student in this kind of setting does wonders for me. On the other hand, it puts me in this very peculiar position. I somehow feel, and I told Mrs. Dalton that I would say so, that imagine my being caught between two titans, one my tutor and the other used to be my tutee. And so with this kind of nervousness, which you'll understand, I'll also try to do something which is not very easy for me to do, and Sid knows it well, and that is to speak briefly. A kid, Sid, as we call him, makes it difficult for me to do so, because once you start to look at the list of achievements, and more so if you've been close to him to have experienced some of the efforts and accomplishments that led to those achievements, you're led to think much more than perhaps the role today demands. And so you find yourself recalling incidents in addition to just looking at a record of achievement. And nevertheless, in order to give the man of the day his time, I'm going to try to be brief. Sidney Mintz was born in 1922 in Dover, New Jersey. And by his own statement, he informs us that his father was a cook and his mother an organizer for the industrial workers of the world. Knowing Sid Mintz, you can realize that those parental influences have been retained for a long time. There's not a time that I did not visit, and actually sometimes stay over time, at the Mintz's home, that Sid did not cook. He cooks well. And therefore, I'm not surprised to see or to read and to read about the major work that he has done on food. He was the youngest of 4 children, the only male, and after high school, he began his undergraduate at Brooklyn College, majoring in psychology. And shortly thereafter, earning a C, as he discloses. He entered the Army, the Air Corps, a week after graduation. And what he does not disclose is that we almost met in Nebraska. I happened many years after to have gone there as a transfer student from Panama, and speaking to me about his past, mentioned that he had done some duty in Lincoln, Nebraska. He points out that one of his first courses as he enters Columbia as a graduate student was sociology, and that he disliked it. And subsequent to that, he entered anthropology, which obviously he not only liked, but loved it enough to master it. One of his major field works was to be on the corporate sugar plantation, U.S. corporate plantation in Puerto Rico, and he did work under some of the greater well-known names of the field, even today, Julian Stewart, Ruth Benedict, and others. And it is somewhat in that context that I would meet him, because having as my professor an historian from Nebraska, and Latin American is a rather well-known one, he suggested to me that I should look at this program on Caribbean studies that would take place in the University of Puerto Rico. And I found out later that one of the people who read my application and therefore must have been influenced by and influential in getting me admitted to that program was Sid Mintz, in which I was concerned with the presence of Afro-Antillians and the Latin American or Central American isthmus, and something about institutions which were used by them in the maintenance of their culture and the pursuit of certain kinds of political and economic growth within not only the Central American republics per se, but the Canal Zone, which was American run, in fact. My first actual meeting with Mintz will take place at the airport when he was slated to come to give us a speech or lecture. And there was an entourage of various scholars, Puerto Ricans, Americans, and others who met him at the airport. And I was obviously very overwhelmed by the presence of his presence, and even more so his presentation, which was a sort of revisiting of his work in Puerto Rico. Since then, since Puerto Rico, of course, Mintz went on to do field work in several other Caribbean countries and other countries in the world, among them Haiti and Jamaica, and those will be two, at least that plus one of them plus Puerto Rico would be the subject of his presentation to us over the next 3 days. I want to share with you some of his achievements, particularly those of us who may not be anthropologists or who have been somewhat far removed from him in recent times, in terms of who is the person that is going to be speaking to us today. In addition to teaching at Yale, which was acknowledged, he has taught at several other places: the University of Puerto Rico, École Pratique des Hautes Études, and the Florida International University, to run the gamut from one end to the other. There are several other details that you will surely have known or will find by reading. Among his tutors in the field, I mentioned Ruth Benedict, who did a project on contemporary cultures, and he was her assistant. And then he has done work, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Haiti, also Iran, and Hong Kong. He's earned several fellowships, some rather well known in his field: the Wenner-Gren Foundation, the Guggenheim Social Science Research Council, and others that are perhaps a little more particular. One Fulbright Fellowship, the Center for Livable Future Fellow. And of course, the next place where we met, a fellowship from the Smithsonian Institution. It's a Smithsonian Institution Regents Fellow. He's given several lectures of renown and note. One at my alma mater, University of California, Harry Hoyger Memorial Lecturer. Other, the Walter Rodney Memorial Lecturer. And another yet, the Elsa Govaya Lecturer, University of the West Indies. The latter two sort of underline the area in which we have shared some interest, and the people that we have had and learned to have great admiration for as scholars, or leading scholars of the field. I had an opportunity, while being the director of the program at Yale, to have gone to several meetings due to the auspices of Sid Mintz or his intervention. And one of them was serving on the Committee for African American Studies at the Ford Foundation, and also to be involved at the Social Science Research Council Committee on Afro-American Societies and Culture.
2 minutes.
One more. That's what I said, too much.
2 minutes over.
Yes, and then there are honors, well-deserving honors, well-sounding honors that I'd like to share one or two with you. The Lewis Henry Morgan Memorial Lecturer, the Walter Rodney Memorial Lecturer, Honoris Causa, University of Puerto Rico, and the Premio Internacional Fundación Fernando Ortiz, as well as the Elsa Govaya Lecturer at the University of the West Indies. Among his writings, of course, we now are celebrating that of Sweetness and Power, but I have had a particular fondness for the birth of the African American culture, which I used every semester that I taught African American studies at Colgate. Having said that, and well knowing that I could say more, and well knowing that Sid is saying, why doesn't he stop talking? As you saw, hinted by my student. I want to introduce you to Professor Mintz.
It's a very great honor to have been chosen to deliver these lectures. I'm keenly aware of that, and I'm grateful to Skip and also to Roy for his pithy and brief and generous introduction. There comes a time in life when it's very easy to confuse introductions with obituaries. And I'm not quite at that point. So, Roy, thank you for being pithy. This lecture is about Jamaica. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, whose achievements these lectures honor, was 32 years old at the dawn of the 20th century, the century to which we have only recently bade farewell. Du Bois predicted that the 20th would be the century of the color line, and we're entitled to ask ourselves if the 21st promises to be different. W.E.B. Du Bois had grasped the reality of an American hemisphere that extended thousands of miles beyond the United States and was composed in large measure of people of color. He realized, long before most of his fellow citizens, the tremendous scale of the peculiar institution and its demographic consequences that slavery had led to the birth of the black Americas. Du Bois understood that the reason why enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas largely predetermined where they would end up. He saw, too, that the countries which lay within Afro-America and Indo-America stood in particular relationships to a United States that had begun only during the years of his youth to exploit the virtues of an aggressive hemispheric imperialism. Within the vast terrain of Afro-America, the Antilles and their nearby mainland shores are a geographically modest but historically important subregion with which Du Bois's personal history was much involved. He was descended on his father's side from ancestors linked to the Republic of Haiti, post-revolutionary French Saint-Domingue, where Du Bois's grandfather, Alexandre Du Bois, lived for more than a decade, and where Du Bois's own father, Alfred, was born. Du Bois was keenly aware of this. David Lewis, his biographer, tells us his rather vague references to that side of his family were ambivalent because his father as much as deserted his mother. He himself learned of the Caribbean region by reading and travel. In 1915, when he visited Jamaica, he was received by Jamaica's Fabian socialist governor at the time, Sidney Haldane Olivier, and there he met Marcus Garvey. In Jamaica, he told his readers in The Crisis, for the first time in his life, and I quote, "I lived beyond the color line." Unforgettable for him was the experience of being in a country with an overwhelming black majority, a country full of black professionals and political figures. Du Bois's Caribbean links were many. While writing his doctoral thesis on the slave trade to the New World, he had learned how far-flung and enduring had been the empire of the whip. Born in 1868, He was nearly 20 years old by the time Cuba finally ended slavery in 1886. And he had just turned 20 when Brazilian abolition brought it to an end in the hemisphere 2 years later. From other scholars, especially Columbia anthropologist Franz Boas, Du Bois learned of the civilizational importance of Africa itself. Throughout his life, his fascination with Africa outweighed his interest in the Caribbean region. But we need to remember, as we celebrate the centenary of the Souls of Black Folk, another of Du Bois's brilliant books, Black Folk Then and Now, where he makes plain his realization of the historical significance of the Antilles as the seedbed of European overseas capitalism and the cradle of black resistance in revolutionary French Saint-Domingue. My own grasp of the character of the Caribbean region is by no means so confident as I would like. There are so many pieces, and change, rapid sometimes and sometimes slow, has never ceased there. But I am by training an anthropologist, and that has influenced my sense of how one goes about learning. Many anthropologists work in a characteristic way, staying a long time in one place that is strange or new to them, and getting to know just a few persons in that place truly well, usually persons of the sort called ordinary people. I tried to do that, and most of what I will say here deals with inhabitants of the three pieces of the Antillean mosaic that I know best. I hope what I learned by listening and watching in these places will help us see something about each of them. If we get some sense of their fit within the larger region, it may help us infer some things about that larger region itself. Within each of the three Antillean societies where I worked, I had chosen a particular problem, or to say it differently, I had tried to answer a particular question having to do with rural life and social history. In Jamaica, I looked at what could be called a religiously created peasant community in order to ask to what extent its nature had been shaped by the way it had come into existence. In Haiti, I studied rural market women to learn how they were articulated to the national economy. And in Puerto Rico, I studied sugar plantation workers to learn what economic and cultural forms North American imperialism had assumed after its military conquest of that society. I chose the three societies in question as part of a larger ambition to familiarize myself with the four major imperial traditions in the region: Spanish, British, French, and Dutch. And up to the last, I almost succeeded. What I hope to do here is wholly different from my original intentions when I worked in these places. Almost from the start, I have looked at the Caribbean region as one made coherent not only by its geography, climate, and terrain, but also by a largely common history. That history was built on its tropical location, its mostly insular conformation, and its early conquest by the Europeans. But it was its fitness for exploitation through slavery in the plantation system, and emergent world capitalism's readiness to batten on the needs and desires of the peoples of the conquering nations that made its colonization such an enormous European success. What I wish to suggest is that important differences among the three societies in which I worked are attributable to their distinctive features, even if we take into account the regional's historical commonality. My hope is that this exercise will cast some light on the region in its totality. Allow me a few more words on anthropology. Without dwelling overlong on a subject I've addressed elsewhere, I should mention that, except for archaeology, physical anthropology, and folklore, anthropology had mostly ignored or disdained the Caribbean region until after World War II, principally because its peoples were not, to use the once popular term, primitives. Anthropologists were not interested exactly because Caribbean history was from so early on entangled with European intentions and their consequences. Caribbean cultures were viewed as imperfect artifacts of Western design. Its social organization and kinship systems were considered rudimentary, incomplete. Its languages defective. Its peoples mixed or mongrelized. It seemed to lack three sociological features I believe to be quite spurious, that seemed to have been important to anthropologists even if they were unwilling to admit it: purity, isolation, and romance. Anthropologists who did study the Caribbean region found it interesting, but instead of inspiring reverence for antiquity or purity, it somehow seemed at once new and tattered. It wafted no aroma of historical depth. As one eminent Caribbean writer has put it, it is a region typified by an absence of ruins. Probably only one North American anthropologist before the 1940s thought that the study of Caribbean peoples might illuminate important issues in the study of culture, abstractly conceived, or provide theoretical insights, despite its culturally many-stranded history. Perhaps it is good to mention this now because the last 2 decades have heard much hubbub about how the world is changing, expressed in this case by such terms as globalization and creolization. I will touch here on what might be learned about these concepts in studying Caribbean peoples. The words now stand for unprecedented transformations, and the use of creolization to describe the underlying cultural processes suggests that the Caribbean region, so long presumed to have nothing to teach us, is not so anthropologically irrelevant as was once supposed. It is important to recall that the Caribbean is the oldest colonial region in modern Western history, predating the rest of Latin America, all of the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, outer Asia, insular Oceania, and nearly all of sub-Saharan Africa. We can, if we wish, talk about the Canary Islands or Cyprus, and some European adventures in South Asia and the Pacific were approximately coeval with the Caribbean case. But the first true oceanic colonies taken as parts of global empires were the Antilles. As it turned out, their main role came to be that of supplying new consumers' goods, particularly stimulants and their accompaniments, for mass European markets. The means for obtaining labor during most of their post-Columbian history was, of course, enslavement. Together, these ancient colonies became the first region in modern times where distinctive social systems arose, combining peoples of differing cultures, social statuses, and physical types in a European model of dependency, and in accord with a formula repeated over and over in the larger regional complex now labeled Afro-America, the South Atlantic System, or more stylishly these days, the Black Atlantic. What underlay that distinctive development, more than anything else, was sucrose. Sucrose, or as we call it, sugar, became a signature commodity for late 17th century Europe, in providing for the first time a cheap, new, and desirable good to more and more consumers. Sugar, like tea or chocolate or coffee or tobacco, became a rich symbol of rising capitalist practice. For Europeans investing in the slave trade and New World plantations, sugar became a source of great wealth. By supplying, in place of bread and meat, delicious low-cost substitute calories mixed into caffeine-carrying drinks, the plantations also reduced the cost to the European economies of maintaining their urban laboring populations. Though Spain introduced sugarcane slaves and the plantation to the Caribbean islands, Portugal was the colonial power that first launched sugar production on a large scale in Brazil. Its accompanying successes among European consumers were regarded enviously by the British and the French. The Dutch, too, had once vied with the Portuguese in producing sugar on the mainland. When Britain laid claim to Barbados around 1628, the English had long been searching for easy tropical colonies in which to produce sugar, and Barbados was their first real opportunity to do so. The colonists there tried other crops before sugar and other labor forms before and alongside slavery. But by 1650, Barbados had become an immensely lucrative place for using African slaves to produce sugar, molasses, and rum for consumers of all classes at home. Though there was hope at first to wrest the entire European sugar market from the Portuguese, Barbadian planters soon discovered that the British lust for sweetness was almost insatiable and the domestic market seemingly infinite. But Barbados was small, 166 square miles, and its soils, flora, and fauna were brought under intense pressure. When in 1655, Admirals Penn and Venables, sent to the Caribbean by Cromwell as part of the Western design, seized Jamaica from Spain, Britain's overseas plantation system got an enormous boost. Within 3 decades, Jamaica, more than 4,000 square miles larger than Barbados, rich in fertile alluvial floodplains, lush interior valleys, with large forests and ample water, and untouched by European agricultural methods, had quite outstripped little Barbados. Between about 1670 and 1800, Jamaica's plantation economy grew apace, and it became one of the most lucrative colonies in British colonial history. People are constantly calling them rich colonies. It's the richest colony. They weren't rich. They were profit-making. They were poor as hell, but they made money. Between about 1670 and 1800, Jamaica's plantation economy grew apace, and it became one of the most lucrative colonies in British colonial history. Upward of 1 million enslaved Africans were imported to Jamaica during that era, the vast majority of them to work on sugar plantations. The Jamaican economy therefore took on a character that was largely defined by one crop, its social structure closely integrated with that economy. A small, immensely powerful planter class dominated both. In time, a similarly small, nearly powerless class of free people of mixed ancestry took shape, working for the planters, running small shops or inns in the towns, serving as clerks and as concubines, practicing special trades. Undergirding these two small groups at any one time were hundreds of thousands of slaves, both captive Africans and the descendants of enslaved Africans of past generations. The social and sexual relations among these different groups are relevant to the way in which Jamaica took on its distinctive character. The social system as a whole would have functioned more smoothly in 17th or 18th century Jamaica if the planters had not raped their female slaves. And though the planters knew it, they raped their female slaves anyway. It was socially and ideologically inconvenient to create a class of persons of mixed ancestry, particularly when it was composed of the planters' bastard sons and daughters. The planters sought to resolve that inconvenience for the most part by keeping their children together with their mothers as their slaves. There were inspiring exceptions, but not so many as one might think. Such behavior was also inconvenient because numerous Europeans, including even many English persons, considered it immoral and even, to use a word of those times, unnatural. What made it most inconvenient of all was that some of the people in Jamaica itself, including occasional relatives of the planters and many of the slaves, also thought that it was, at the very least, not quite cricket. To be sure, slavery was regarded quite matter-of-factly as moral by most persons. But being a slave owned by one's own father does not conduce either to filial piety or to moral confidence in the social system under which one lives. It certainly didn't in Jamaica. Probably it should be added here that gender distinctions as well as race figured importantly in Jamaican history. Plantation slavery, because of the work regimen and the use of violence, tended to de-emphasize sexual differences to a large degree. In many ways, male and female slaves were treated alike. And though the enslaved Africans who were stolen from their natal villages and brought to places like Jamaica often brought with them learned, culturally specific conceptions of themselves as males and females, as boys and girls, or men and women, capture, enslavement, the Middle Passage, and the plantation regimen did much to obliterate those learned conceptions. Nevertheless, people seem to need social categories to be able to live and to interact. And so even though slavery probably led to equally bad treatment for its male and female victims, the slaves developed social codes of their own. It must also be said that though slavery tended to erode gender distinctions, men and women were distinguished on the plantations, at least to the extent that it was recognized both that men were physically stronger for plantation labor than were women, and that women could be assaulted sexually and could become mothers as well as mistresses and concubines. In other words, though the system reduced gender differences and mostly leveled the treatment of the slaves, as the social system took shape and as the planters extended their control, some gender differences were imposed and even reshaped. Over time, plantation slavery also provided raw material for the creation of social norms in regard to race. Dating from the conquest by Britain, Jamaica's population had been British and African. As the plantation system succeeded economically, the proportion of people of African descent grew sharply. By the time that the plantations were at their apogee, although the number of free white and mixed persons had grown, they remained fractions of the total population. About 35,000 free mixed persons and 30,000 free whites, with a slave population of nearly 340,000. Physical traits were seen as tightly linked to social status. There were no phenotypically white persons who were slaves and no phenotypically black persons in the planter class. Even slight phenotypical differences came to be considered important for classifying individuals socially. One did not have to be white to be racially prejudiced. The bias toward whiteness was strong, and it has endured. The attitudes about color and its role in allocating or validating status in a truly hierarchical system have remained, I think, surprisingly stable. Another important feature of Jamaican plantation society, which figures in what I shall say later, has to do with feeding the slaves. In the decades following the conquest of Jamaica in 1655, there developed hardly any small farmer population that produced subsistence for the plantations or for non-farming free people. Food had to be imported for nearly everyone, or else the slaves had to produce it. Planters were loath to take their slaves away from plantation tasks to grow food. It was sometimes done by squads of slaves working together under a foreman's direction, but that was not a popular solution. Yet there were also problems with importing food. When overseas transport was stopped by weather or war, the slaves, chronically undernourished and usually hungry, would starve to death. I footnote this. In 1780 to 1787, somewhere between 15,000 and 24,000 Jamaican slaves are believed to have died of hunger, primarily because the North American food trade was disrupted by the American Revolution. But there was a third way to obtain food, and that was to enable the slaves to produce it on a family basis. This solution must have been tried for the first time in Jamaica in the first half of the 18th century, if not earlier, and proved enormously successful. By 1790, production of a substantial portion of slave subsistence by individual slaves and their families had become island-wide. The custom was to assign to individual slaves plots of plantation land unsuitable for sugarcane. It was usually not fertile or well-watered. It was in gullies or covered in brush or lay far from the center of the plantation. No one supposed that the slaves came to own it or to have legal claim over it by virtue of working it. But all the same, it became the practice to respect the slave's labor investment in it. If the planter wanted that plot of land for a different purpose, it was widely expected he would give the slave cultivator land of equal quality and quantity to plant elsewhere and would pay for the lost product. A famous 18th century Jamaican writer, Brian Edwards, actually uses the old Latin term peculium to refer to the slave's claim over his product. As both the planter and the slave recognized, such practices meant that some basic aspects of the relationship between slaves and masters was changed. The slaves accepted the opportunity to grow their own food, even though it meant more labor on their part. It enabled them to eat better. But it also gave the slaves a chance to plan, to mobilize their family labor, to produce goods that they could take to market and sell, and to participate in the wider economy of Jamaican society. Though the planters benefited enormously from slave labor freely given from the limited time the slaves had left after doing their allotted tasks on the plantation, the slaves also benefited from improved nutrition and from the chance to exercise autonomy within a system that sought in nearly every other way to crush it. Very soon, the Jamaican internal market system was dominated by the slaves. Because they learned in this manner to produce their own food, go to market to buy and sell, plan the labor of their families, and even accumulate wealth, I began calling such people proto-peasants, peasants who were still slaves, peasants to be, peasants in embryo. Their emergence as an economic force in slave-era Jamaica was one of the trade-offs with which the planters had to live. I'm sure that to some extent economic activity by the slaves, who were pro-slavery rhetoric, had it, quite incapable of even the simplest tasks without the blessings of enslavement and white guidance, made clear to the world that the entire system rested on the branding iron, the whip, and lots of hot air expended in defense of forced labor. The end of the slave trade came in 1808. Slavery was replaced by the so-called apprenticeship, a terrible transitional interval, in 1834. And slavery ended August the 1st, 1838. Around 310,000 Jamaican slaves became free on that day. This momentous change in status was accompanied by a wide variety of acts by the planter class aimed to limit and confine the newly freed and to subvert their quest for economic security and civil equality. The most important economic changes wrought by emancipation in Jamaica were the sharp decline in available labor for the planters and the rise of new peasant villages under religious leadership. These two changes were interrelated. A variety of legislative ruses were used by the Jamaica Assembly, wholly dominated by the planters, to subjugate the freed persons and to import cheap contract labor to undercut the bargaining power of the freed in the labor market. They were partly successful in both regards. But the persisting long-term objectives of the planters were best revealed at the time of the so-called Morant Bay Rebellion, nearly 30 years later in 1865. This so-called rebellion, it was a land riot, it was not a rebellion. This land riot resulted in martial law, the death by hanging of hundreds of freed persons, and the recall of Governor Eyre, under whose rule the gradual evolution of a peasant society was forever crushed. To hide successfully the real motive of the freed persons, which was to gain legal access to land, it was first necessary to convince the colonial office and the British people that the freed persons rebelled against constituted authority. And indeed, several government officials were killed. But what the crowds were protesting against was Her Majesty's government's total unwillingness to help a peasant system of production to grow, at any cost at all, to the plantation, even though the Crown's economic interest in the plantation system had come to an end much earlier. The fate of the Jamaican people was simply not as important to the Crown as the welfare of Jamaica's exiguous but racist and violent planter class. Responding condignly, Jamaica's planters abdicated their responsibility in the Assembly and legislated themselves out of office, rather than permit the Jamaican people to achieve political equality. Hence, Jamaica was permitted to regress anew to the status of Crown colony, to be ruled directly from Britain. Though the Jamaican peasantry would endure, it would not be allowed to grow. Had the ballot been gradually extended to the Jamaican people, what would have happened to the planters and their near monopoly of the land was clear. In this case, a society's future was cast in iron by its ruling class in collusion with the metropolitan ruler. Though surely each case is unique and no two instances are identical, the British West Indian sugar colonies shared important features. In all, economic power after emancipation remained vested in a numerically small white ruling group. In all, the social structure had at least 3 tiers consisting of white planters, a tiny mixed-race middle class, and a vast mass of poor and mostly landless black freed persons. In all, physical appearance was both a coefficient and to some degree a determinant of social status and life chances. Jamaica was the most populous and important of the British Caribbean colonies when freedom came. Now independent, it has retained many features of this colonial past. In June 1952, when I went to Jamaica for fieldwork, I knew what I wanted to study. I'd read that when slavery ended in Jamaica in 1834, the missionary churches, aided by the abolitionists, could take much credit for the event. A large number of slaves joined those churches, Methodist, Baptist, and others. They and their ministers were able to count on planter intemperance, which included the burning of churches, to provide them with sympathetic supporters and listeners in Britain. But nothing at all had been done by the Jamaica Assembly or by the Colonial Office to ease the transition for the slaves. For the planters in the British West Indies, yes, they had been given advance compensation for their property to the tune of £20 million sterling. And an opportunity to exploit their slaves, now called apprentices, for some additional years. But nothing was done for the slaves because it was expected, and indeed widely hoped, that freedom would not interfere in the slightest with the continued subjection of their labor to the plantation system. When the apprenticeship was discarded and freedom came on August 1, 1838, the idea arose to create new villages for freed people on exhausted or runate land. This movement was not created to attack planter power, but there were aspects to the post-slavery era that made the free village system extremely important. The planters, desirous of more labor, would not pay a living wage under any circumstances. In spite of the indemnities paid them, they resented emancipation, they felt that the freed people were ingrates, and they begrudged them even the shacks they occupied on plantation land. Laborers who refused to work as frequently or for as long as the planters wanted were punished for insubordination, even as the planters tried to import additional labor from India and China using taxes imposed upon workers to finance their migration schemes. The newly freed were for the most part willing to work for the planters even for derisory wages, but any alternative economic opportunities would enable them to continue to produce their own food, which they were accustomed to doing, while improving their bargaining position. Anything that made land available to the freed to cultivate was good, in their view. Accordingly, the free village system was a genuine threat in the eyes of the planters and a step toward economic security for the freed. In just a decade, the number of free villages multiplied. Free people produced not only their own food, but also food and goods to sell. They also began to produce modest quantities of exports, including ginger, goat skins, and pimento, allspice. The internal market system grew. These achievements were viewed as threatening by the planters, upstart challenges to the plantation system and to the policy that had maintained the degraded status of the laborers. Any off-plantation production was labeled by the planters a lapse into barbarism. In the view of the planter class, the missionary churches were persisting in their subversion of Jamaican society. It was the growth of those villages and what they meant to people that I wanted to look at. I visited the village I'd learned most about, Sturgetown in St. Anne Parish, named after the famous Quaker abolitionist Joseph Sturge. And after 2 days listening and looking around, I decided to go live there. Among the people I met in Sturgetown was Tom Belnavis, his wife Leah, and their daughters Catherine and Thelma. When I first came to know him, Tom Belnavis was a land-poor peasant. I learned about that listening to him. I have 2 quarters of land down in the bottom, there around the house, and 2 acres in bamboo a couple of miles away. I got 1 quarter for a man died down there and I bought it. Another quarter my grandfather left me here when he died. I was one of 5 children, all boys. I was the oldest, the only bastard. My mother married another after she get me, and my brothers them really half-brothers. I was raised here in my grandfather's house. He was from here. My great-grandmother, she came here to live. She was born as the slavery ended. She was get the night they make freedom. She was born 9 months after. My grandfather raised me here. His father owned the land where the church stands now. I went to school when the school there, back of the church. You can see the foundation. I went only till I was 11. The teacher strict, and I didn't take to the school. 2 years of that I spent under that cabbage leaf tree, hiding from the school. When I was 11, I start man work, working for myself. I have 28 years on the road work. When the headman comes, he must learn from me. You pass the bottom of the big hill on your way to Penshurst today. You mark the moral there. I put that in. They pay 3 shillings per chain, and I put in near to 3 days there. 1 day, then 2nd day my pick broke. 3rd day, yesterday I finished. Hard work, man, but I like hard work. If I don't work hard, I can't sleep. Last year I worked on Landovery Estate, sugar work. I worked night shift, came home at 6 o'clock in the morning and left for my field with my pick and my hoe in my hand. I paid 34 shillings to get my land cleared and readied, and I put in 1,240 heads of cocoa yams. But if a man didn't give me some cocos last week, I wouldn't have tasted them this year. The land is not right for cocos. Weak it is. It is good to the corn, but I forced it with the cocos. The land need the rest. If you can't turn it to rest, it weakens. Look down there in the bottom. Some have an acre, some a half, some only a quarter, or none at all. The land heavy with everything all in one place. Cocoa, yam, breadfruit tree, they grow atop one another. We need land, man. The estates, they won't rent us. Mr. Cox at Knapdale say he's afraid of fire. Tom laughs. These are from my field notes dated July 9th, 1952. Tom Belnavis had much, much more to say, but for where he figures in my story, this may be enough. He was a Jamaican peasant, and in many ways quite like most Caribbean peasants. I call them reconstituted peasants, people descended mostly from enslaved Africans, who were kept in slavery some for centuries, who learned to be peasants while still enslaved, then became peasants, all the while eking out their livings by also working on the road, or in sugar, or raising pigs or goats for market. Like peasants everywhere, they had to have some access to cash because they could not produce everything they consumed. They could not simply barter for all of it. And the state always demands something from them in labor or in cash, preferably in cash. Like just about all Caribbean peasants through history, they have never been able to live adequately by working only with what they own. And what did they want? We cannot say without a certainty. Though there have been countless hundreds of thousands of reconstituted peasants in the Caribbean region during these last 3 centuries, not surprisingly, none has left us an eloquent testimonial to the aspirations and values of the Caribbean peasantry. But if we look at places where Caribbean peasantry was able to form, it seems clear that making a secure living on the land and the production of agricultural commodities for sale were the basic objectives that such people hoped to achieve. It serves no useful purpose to point out to Tom Bell Navis without explanation that societies need infrastructures, public education, governments, police, professional schools. These things were not what Caribbean peasantries had on their minds. They've always been too busy struggling for a secure economic base, and in most places, and until recently, against forces aimed mostly at pushing them off their own land and back onto the plantations. What they aspired to for the last century or two has never been considered a realistic societal goal. In Jamaica, as elsewhere in the region, the equivalent of the black American dream of 40 acres and a mule has died hard. But everywhere that it flowered, it was carefully killed. People like my friend Tom Bell Navis are not easy to kill, but the opportunity in the last 50 years to escape poverty by emigration and the generalized oppression of a poor, still colonial society in which the rewards for industry, honesty, and integrity are few, have led to the near death of the Jamaican peasantry, and indeed of Caribbean peasantry nearly everywhere. In Jamaica, that peasantry lives or lived in the shadow of the national history. Between the slaves and the masters, there grew the intermediate social grouping I referred to earlier, separated by color, social status, economic niche, and political and cultural values from the slaves. When freedom came, that intermediate group became Jamaica's middle class, both rural and urban. What divided them from the slaves has continued to divide them ever since, and they figure in the story. Back in 1952, I would accompany Sturgetown's Higgler women to market. The Brownstown marketplace was about a 7-mile walk from Sturgetown over hard rock paths. It was my habit to walk to town with the Sturgetown Higglers, stay there to take notes on the buying and selling until late the following morning. I would sleep overnight in the market. Perhaps halfway or more toward Brownstown, there was a fork in the road. One fork led to Sturgetown, and the other branch to a nearby cattle farm and dairy owned by a local farmer of light color. Though I had never met him or even seen him, I knew who he was. On one occasion, after I'd slept overnight in the market and was preparing to hike back to Sturgetown, I stopped by the small store and filling station of a friend of mine in town to say hello. I found my friend Pat, a light-complexioned man, quite upset. It turned out that very early that morning, the owner of the dairy farm had shot a man out of a tree on his farm. The dairyman said it had happened because the man was trespassing and stealing mangoes. He denied having meant to shoot him. In fact, he said he discharged his shotgun over his head, not realizing the man was in the tree. A likely story. But in any case, the trespasser was wounded, and Pat said many people were upset. Pat himself was disturbed, angry about an act he called stupid and dangerous. We talked briefly. I was preparing to leave him to start my walk back. My Higgler friends would not leave for another couple of hours, when suddenly who should drive up in his pickup but the dairyman. He was about Pat's color, by which I mean he would attract no attention in the north of the U.S., but Southerners would realize he was colored. I listened to Pat interrogating him. Then he introduced me. The man said, "So you've been living in Sturgetown?" I explained my work. "I'm on my way home now. I can drop you at the fork or give you lunch," he said. I agreed to accompany him. When we reached his house, which turned out to be a large, comfortable farmhouse in the Jamaican style, he made me a drink and left me in the library awaiting lunch. I looked somewhat desultorily at the books there until I came upon a school notebook with what I took to be the name of the dairyman's daughter inside the cover. Though it was ostensibly for taking notes, and there were school notes in it, it was full of drawings, sketches, caricatures of the nastiest racist kind I have ever seen. Most of the drawings were of the artist's school teachers. I had never seen such cruel depictions before. I found myself shocked by the venom they betrayed within the artist. I was caught up in North American perceptions. It occurred to me that the artist was not all white herself, and recognized with another shock my own North American brand of racism. Such awakenings were frequent in my Caribbean fieldwork. My host called out to me, and I hastily returned the notebook to its place. Lunch was served. I was still somewhat bemused by my host's sudden friendliness. His wife was apparently not at home, and we lunched in near silence. But during the lunch, someone knocked at the door, and when the maid went to admit the visitor, it turned out to be the Brownstown constable who had arrived to bring my host to the constabulary. Suddenly I understood why I was so welcome. My host was happy to have a foreigner, a scholar, and a white man at his table when the police came for him. The following week, when I returned to Brownstown Market, I learned that the night after his arraignment, the udders had been cut off half a dozen of the dairyman's cows by someone, repayment, no doubt, for his carelessness with a shotgun. The hostility of the poor toward the relatively rich conformed neatly to the difference in race between the poor and the rich. It was, it seemed to me, a very solid, enduring hostility indeed. My friend Tom Belnavis and my neighbor the dairyman are two figures out of a tableau composed by the people of Sturgetown and its environs. Though surely they do not even think of it this way, they represent the people of Jamaica and of that parish to outsiders like myself. Getting to know them, one enters into the fabric of social relations in a new place and learns how people inside that fabric treat it as life itself, which for them it is. Tom talks about how working hard enables him to sleep. But his wife, Ms. Lee, worked hard too and on the road as well. He breaks up moral with his pick. She kneels, hammer in hand, on a burlap rag torn from a sugar bag and breaks the moral down into small pieces so that it becomes roadbed. She moves a few inches at a time, I kneeling beside her, and she allows me to break some moral with her hammer to see that, like nearly everything in life, it seems to me, it is not as easy as it looks. Ms. Lee is lighter skinned than Tom. Her family didn't want her to marry him, he tells me, and so he says he made her pregnant first, and then her family consented. It was easy to see what made Tom attractive. He had a big voice, and people liked his expansive, cocky manner. He was a rebel of a sort in a community famous in that parish for the obedience and respectability of its inhabitants. That reputation probably came from Sturgetown's beginnings as a Baptist village. People in St. Anne said if you wanted a good serving girl, you should get one from Sturgetown. But Sturgetown was encircled by large estates, such that it was hard to rent any land on which to cultivate, and really impossible to buy any. Tom's shoes were rough, over-the-ankle boots made in Jamaica. He nailed mule shoes to them to keep them from wearing out. When he came down the road singing, sparks sometimes flew from his shoes. He knew that Sturgetown is full of well-behaved people. It annoyed him that he couldn't get his hands on more land there. The church had some, but it favored the regular churchgoers. Ms. Lee helped him make a go of things by her work on the road. She saved for the girls' education. Tom said women have better heads for business than men, a view shared by a surprisingly large number of Jamaican peasants. Tom's vocation as a peasant clung to him. After one of my trips to town with the Higglers, I stopped by the Chinese grocery in Brownstown. At that time, nearly every town in Jamaica had a Chinese grocery, to buy a present for Tom. In the refrigerated food case, I found an apple, an imported rarity in Jamaica, and one I was sure he had never tasted. He was touched by my gift, and we ate it together. But he was extremely careful when he cut it open, because he wanted the seeds. I need to see if I can make the seeds them grow, he said reflectively. Over and over, I heard the cries for help of people like Tom Belnavis. But there are reasons why his cries differed from those of Haitian and Puerto Rican peasants. So did his attitudes about men and women. So did his ideas about race. Let me add another word about them. Jamaica was a society in which new or added class distinctions developed slowly. For most of its history, it has been a kind of colonial squirearchy, but the squires were sugar planters. Not until the mid-19th century, with the end of protectionism for West Indian sugar, did that begin to give way. And since slavery ended only in 1834-38 and the Morant Bay Rebellion led to the return of Crown rule after 1865, planter power persisted, even though bound less and less to the land alone. Throughout the last century, people like Tom Belnavis clung to the bits of land that they had or tried to get some land of their own. There was the practice of emigrating to make money and coming back to buy land with it, or adding to the bit one had by buying another small piece next to it. Some of the land would be family land, a specific term for land that was neither to be divided nor sold, to which kinship was the only mode of access, as Jean Besson's work has made so clear. Tom's and Leah's ancestors came to freedom with a healthy respect for gender equality, particularly when they acquired land. Jamaican slaves, proto-peasants, had been taking their produce to market for more than a century before freedom came. The accounts of the 18th century tell us that before freedom, whole families went to the marketplace. After freedom, with certain important exceptions, internal marketing became largely a female specialization, while cultivation became mostly the work of males. Women are housekeepers and cooks, but they also do most of the higgling. They probably learn more about the market, about bargaining, about currency than men. Men are more occupied with the crops than with the market. In a very general way, males and females tend to divide up by occupation. Men make furniture, baskets, tailoring, some ironwork. They do the fishing. Women make clothing, launder, shop for things to resell, go to the market, and may buy there for resale to their villages. The readiness of Jamaican rural males to attribute superior commercial talent and know-how to their wives, sisters, and daughters may spring from a real historical and gender difference in their relationship to the market. But because land is scarce and wage labor an almost unavoidable additional source of income, men cannot farm with the same assurance that their wives can higgle. Though a class of moderately prosperous farmers did arise, it is small. It grew slowly. The items that can be produced for export are limited, and the small-scale producers can look to the state for little or no help at all. The state devotes itself to the needs of the plantations, the cattle farms. Men's work and women's work remain divided and complementary. Race raises different issues. Jamaican rural people are sharply aware of differences in hair form, skin color, and so on. They have, as do Caribbean people everywhere it seems, a complex glossary of description. North Americans visiting Jamaica or Haiti for the first time are likely to be struck by how dark people are there when compared to black Americans. There are not many who look like Holland Powell relative to the whole population. And the social and economic scale corresponds quite faithfully to the scale of appearance, with the lighter people, of course, mostly near the top. Tom was a dark man. His wife Leah was quite a lot lighter. Tom saw the links between color and privilege, though he did not seem bitter about them. I once asked him, after we had met at a church social event, a man in a neighboring village who was nearly white, what Jamaicans thought when they met a poor white man. I mean, that's quite a thing to meet in Jamaica, a poor white man. What do you think, I said, when you meet a poor white man? A poor white man, he repeated, smiling. We laugh. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to ask him about the trigger-happy dairyman. When I first went to Jamaica, it was not possible to find a salesgirl in the larger and more expensive stores in Kingston who was not fair in complexion. Thinking back, I remember that Eric Williams had judged this custom harshly in his writing on Jamaica. But I also recalled W.E.B. Du Bois approving a somewhat curious remark about Kingston's nearly white shop girls who, he wrote, with, quote, a curl or tint proclaimed the most ancient of blood. Williams was shocked that no very dark girls worked in these stores. Du Bois was happy to discover a curl or a tint. Their views of what they were seeing clearly differed. The guest houses in which I stayed during my visits to Kingston were invariably operated by light-skinned women, usually unmarried, and I was given a concise reason why. Their brothers marry English women while they're studying in the UK and bring them back, and since the sisters cannot marry beneath their color, they usually stay single, people told me. Haitians and Puerto Ricans would certainly understand, but it would not mean precisely the same thing to them. I believe that neither in Haiti nor in Puerto Rico would such a marriage be so harshly enjoined by society. And so we see that Jamaica was not, is not, simply another example of a single species, but a distinctive society in its own right, shaped by its history, by the peoples who came to live in it, and by the imperial rule and culture to which it was subjected. The thirst for land that marked the end of slavery arose there as it did in the cases to follow. The concern with color, with race, is as lively in one as in the other. But these three societies are different from each other, and in ways best understood by listening to and watching the people who compose them. That takes time, but the generalities with which one is left come from the lives and mouths of the people. And what could be better than that? And this is my first colony. Thank you.
Thank you, Sid. Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions, and afterwards we'll have a reception at the back of the room. So please stay and join us for food and drink and celebrate Sid's presence among us. Questions, please.
I'm going to take this interval when there's no questions to say that I've been teaching now for 54 years, and I'm used to long silences.
Questions? Yes.
About how it's hard to, become part of the community that she's, observing.
Yeah, I can't hear you myself.
I'm sorry. Okay. In Hurston's Meals and Men, she talked about trying to become a part of the community so that she can observe them. So what were your hardships in Jamaica trying to achieve that?
One of the difficulties plainly in being a white person and working in a place like Jamaica is that you are a white person. But that difficulty is really not so insoluble as it might at first seem. I discovered very early in my field work that wherever I am, if I'm in the countryside, and I go into somebody's backyard, and they take a plant that's growing there and say to the man of the house, "What is this?" And then when he tells me, I say, "When do you plant it, and for how long? And what do you do with the product, and how do you process it?" This will be, for this guy, the first time in his life that anybody ever treated with respect what he knows. The only thing foreigners ever ask us people is, how do you get the Montego Bay? All you have to do to get people to treat you like a human being is treat them like you. And I've never had a difficulty in that regard in the Caribbean. Now, I can imagine situations where it would be difficult. It's very difficult for a young male to work with female informants in rural Puerto Rico. Well, there are certain things that we either know or learn very quickly. But that said, I don't think that these problems are as big as they're claimed to be. I really don't. The other thing is, you don't bring much with you. You eat what they eat. You wear what they wear. You sleep on what they sleep. Because if you've got to bring along everything you have from back home in order to make yourself comfortable, sure they're not going to accept.
Yes, miss.
First of all, I'd like to say it's been a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you.
And I'd like to challenge that comment you made. You've spoken about the complexities of race in the Caribbean, and this lady just asked you about what it was like being a white man in Jamaica doing research. I was wondering if you could comment about, for example, there are a lot of non-white anthropologists are now going to the Caribbean, like myself. I do fieldwork in Cuba, and I think it's a quite different situation that most of us walk into in terms of trying to be ethnographers and trying to, resolve for ourselves and for the people we come in contact with, the newness of race in this new context. So I've been baffled about how race might come into my analysis and how I might represent my experiences of being black and being treated black in Cuba without it infringing on the ethnography that I'm trying to produce. So I still haven't resolved that, and as of this point I've left it out altogether, but I think it's wrong to leave it out because it was such a strong and such a prevalent part of my fieldwork.
One of the things I would ask you, I suppose, is whether it would be possible for you to try to write up something like being a black ethnographer in a racist society, colon, my experience. In other words, whether you could set apart from the other material you've gathered your personal experience and make that in itself a paper. Plainly, it's artificial to separate these sorts of things, but we have to try to. We have to do our best to. And I think my own experience, I've never done fieldwork in Cuba, but I was there last year and I spent 10 days outside Cienfuegos in a black community, in fact. And I didn't have any trouble there at all. Now, it's true, other people have been working with these folks, so that made it easier for me. But I think it's necessary both to try to separate these experiences and record them, and to the extent possible to see in what way they are integrated with each other. A quick story. In Jamaica, on one occasion, I was talking to a lady in her house, and she was showing me her children, her baby and her little girl. And she said to me, I bathe the little girl in sarace tea all the time because it makes her lighter. And I said, I was trapped because I didn't want to say that she was lighter than the older child, that this baby was lighter than the older child. And I said, well, it doesn't seem to make a lot of difference to me. But I knew that whatever I said, I was going to put my foot in it, and I had. These are difficult issues for all of us, I think. I have no special advice, except, as I say, meeting people in the Caribbean, I've always counted heavily on their courtliness and my ignorance.
Orlando Patterson.
Thanks for that talk. Very much. Thank you. The Jamaica you described was the Jamaica of a half a century ago, and
that's when I was there.
Good,
yes.
There's been, in economic terms, sadly, not as many changes as one would have liked, but in cultural and social terms, there's been a virtual revolution in Jamaica, including attitude towards race and color.
Yeah.
I just wondered, including the fact that, there was a musical revolution since then. There was no reggae when you were there. Which is, I can't imagine Jamaica without reggae. But I just wondered, as one of the eminent anthropologists who've worked in that area and contributed so much to our understanding of it, what's your view of the changes since during that half a century? What strikes you as the most important in terms of what survived from that post-emancipation era and what's changed? Can you like to reflect on that for us?
Yeah, that's awfully hard to try to answer since I've done no other field work there, Orlando, since, it's been so many years since I did field work. In my third lecture, since each one is on a different place, in my third lecture I want to make some general observations, and one of those will be on the fact that key economic regions change in the world scene, owing to forces over which we as individuals and even sometimes as countries have very little control. The Caribbean, as you know, was a kind of jewel in the British imperial diadem. And there were years when French Saint-Domingue was more profitable to France than India was to Britain. I mean, these were important places. Now they're not. They're important because they produce great scholars. They're important because they produce a lot of marijuana. They're important because our junior college students go there for vacations. But they're not important the way Iraq just turned out to be important. Because economic and political forces of world dimension move from one area to another, and some places become backwaters and others become... That's the general framework in which I might say something, but I really shrink from trying to say anything about how to evaluate the changes of the last half century.
Yes, sir.
I must say that it's a pleasure to listen to you because I'm an anthropologist and I know very few anthropologists who work at both the historical systemic level and the ethnographic vernacular level. So it's a real pleasure to hear you speak. My question has to do with the English, or maybe the British. It's one of the common places that the English were more racial, did not intermarry with other peoples, unlike the French and the Spanish. I think this view tends to come from post-1800s and tends to be in the East Indies. Before the 1800s, as is clear from what you said in your work, that they did at least cohabitate or copulate, if not intermarry with other peoples. The best answer I've gotten is from Ronald Hyam, who thinks that it has to do with the Haitian slave revolt and the distrust of Creoles. So the British did practice miscegenation, but they did not legalize the union. And similar thing happened with the Dutch in Java. Now, what is it that makes the English or the British different from the Spaniards or the French? Does it have to do with Catholic Church, Protestants, souls?
I'm going to talk tomorrow about Haiti, and of course I will make reference to comparable, similar processes there. And also I will say some of the same in regard to Puerto Rico. It's a very difficult question, even to make guesses about.
Any other questions? Why don't we ask Sid over wine and food? Let's thank Sidney Mintz.